Hi everyone, it's Tarrant.
And Stella from Meeple University.
Today we'll be teaching you how to play Horseless Carriage, game designed by Jeroen Doorman and Joris Viersinge and published by Splotter Spellen.
Let's get to the game.
In Horseless Carriage, players are industrialists in the early era of motor car development, trying their best to make their fortune in the new business. Using the small confines of the gradually growing factory floor they have available, players will develop and build the newest technologies available in cars, expand into the latest consumer models, and establish and market their own dealerships in order to get their products to the consumer. At the same time, players work to manipulate and corner a market whose interests in range, safety, reliability, speed and design changes like the weather. Whoever can earn the most money from selling cars will win the game. I won't step you through setup for the game, but I'll introduce you to the components. In the centre of the table, you will have a number of stacks of tiles, each of which represents one of the stations that you can build into your factory. The number of each depends on your player count. You will have the main lines representing your assembly lines in the factory, 17 stacks of stations which represent all of the different car parts you can build, planning and research departments, marketing departments, and dealerships. Marketing and dealerships are split up by player colour, all of the rest are communal. Players begin with a single square factory floor, as well as a planning and research department, and then all of these other components in player colour. There are 5 research tracks, and each of these represents how far a player has researched a certain type of specification for a car. Note that while each of these does match one of the player colours, these tracks and their cubes are not player component pieces. These are all common. But the player coloured pieces on these tracks do represent the players. These tracks represent all of the different car part tokens we saw before and group them according to how they help the car. Here, for example, a nice coat of paint appears on the design track. Some car parts appear on multiple tracks. Tyres will help you with range, safety and speed. This is important because buyers will be purchasing based on the specs, not the parts. For example, a buyer might want reliability but doesn't care which car parts contribute to that reliability. This part of the main board represents the market, and each token placed on this board represents one buyer for cars in this round. This will be fairly bare at the start of the game, but will expand to greater and more exotic collections of car demands as the game goes on. You can think of this market as a big city block, with the rich end of town up here and the poorer end of town down here. And at any given time, the demand and saleability for cars is based on only 2 of the game's 5 specs. Here, for example, reliability and safety would drive the price and sellability of cars. None of the other specs would matter. If your cars have higher reliability and higher safety, then you'll be able to sell to the entire market and get the most lucrative profits. If you're low in one or the other, then you'll be limited to selling to the cheaper end of town. Critically though, the market is always changing, and at the end of each round, one spec will become obsolete and replaced with something else. But going back to setup, you'll have a much emptier board to begin the game. For the 2 specs along the edge of the market board, each player begins the game with 1 free research. Finally, on the right-hand side of the board, you'll have all of the tracks which drive the game. Critically, you have the turn order track, and this is a bidirectional track. Some phases will resolve in engineering order from left to right, and some in sales order from right to left, meaning you'll want to pivot depending on what's important to you in that round. The planning office also has the Gantt track, which impacts your ability to influence turn order. You have the wealth track, where you'll track your money and everyone begins at 0. Minimum specs and assembly capacity, which I'll describe later. And the punch clock track, which is one of the ways for timing when the game will end. So, having seen these components, now let's have a look at how to play. Horseless Carriage plays in rounds, and each round plays in 8 phases. First is research, where you'll use any research stations you've built to advance on the assembly or research tracks. Second is set focus, where players will choose their turn order for the round. Third is build factory, where players will set to work placing tiles on their boards. Fourth is printing sales brochures, where players evaluate what they've put down and work out what that means for the forthcoming phases. Fifth is sell, where players compete to sell their cars in the market. Sixth is finish, and this is where the game ends if the end has been triggered. Seventh is advance expectations, where an old spec becomes obsolete and a new one takes its place. And eighth is grow demand, where players play cards to expand the market and manipulate the prices. The game plays over a maximum of 7 rounds, or until the first finish phase after the punch clock reaches 0. Any time any player's marker is advanced into a space showing the punch clock icon, or any player plays a card showing punch clock icons, the punch clock will move down, bringing the game closer to its finish. Collectively, this means the choices that players make will have an impact on the length of the game. So now let's look at each phase in detail. The first phase is research, and each player will take 1 turn in the previous round's engineering order. On your turn, count the number of research stations on your factory floor. Here it's 3. And then you must make that many research track advancements. This can be increasing your own assembly capacity by 1, giving your main lines more capacity to build cars. Or you could advance one of your markers on a spec track, or you could advance one of your opponent's markers on a spec track. This creates patents for any new car parts that were reached. And as we'll see later, you can access other players' patents, which is why you might increase another player's research. A player may not advance the same marker more than once on their research turn. And you can research the specs which are currently setting the market, or the ones which are off to the side. Second is set focus, and this is all about choosing turn order. At this point, players will have some number of steps on the Gantt track left over from setup or the previous round. In this phase, each player takes 1 turn in order from most Gantt to least, and in the case of a tie, the previous round's engineering focus breaks the tie. On your turn, you have 2 options. You can either spend all of your Gantt down to 0 and then choose your position in this round's turn order. Only spaces within your player count are available. Your second option is to hang on to your Gantt and pass. Once all players have made this choice, any players who chose to pass fill up the remaining spaces from left to right based on the previous round's engineering order. The third and major decision-making phase of the game is building your factory, and here you'll take any number of tiles that you want from the display and add them permanently into your factory floor. This phase is resolved simultaneously. You can place as many tiles as you want, either from your coloured tiles or from the common display as you have space to fit. And there is no resource cost for taking and placing a tile. You can think of the cost as being the space that you've permanently filled up, and the loss of flexibility to later use that space for something else. There are several placement restrictions, and you must meet those restrictions at the end of your placement. That is, it does not matter what order you place your tiles down in, as long as you meet these requirements at the end of the turn. Tiles are limited to the number available in setup, and if a pile of tiles runs out and multiple players want the last one, then whoever is earliest in engineering order gets the tile. Once you've finished, move your focus marker down. The tiles you've placed on your player board may never be moved again for the game. Then take one of the factory floor extension pieces and place it for the next round. You must place it in some way adjacent to the factory you already have. and must always have one square of empty space on the other side of any one of these keep out lines at the bottom of the loading bay. This placement is legal, as is this, but this and this are not allowed. Your placement forces you to pre-plan in which direction you'll be expanding your assembly line for the next round. So now let's look at placement rules. Every tile must be placed adjacent to at least one other tile or a loading bay area. Adjacency means it shares at least one flat edge, so this diagonal connection here is not allowed, but this is. Tiles must fit fully on your board. They cannot overhang the edge of the board, and they cannot overlap any part of a loading bay. The planning and research stations have no other restrictions. As long as they meet these general requirements, they can go anywhere in your factory. Main lines, which are these pieces which produce your cars, and dealers, which are these coloured pieces which sell your cars, are inherently entwined. Each main line must be adjacent to at least one dealer, and each dealer must be adjacent to at least one main line. Dealers can only sell cars from their adjacent main lines. So this placement here is legal, but this one is not because there's no main line connected to the Kansas City dealer. But with this sports car main line here, both of these dealers are now legal. These coloured pieces are marketing departments, and each of these must be placed adjacent to at least one dealer. This placement would not be legal. Efficient placement of these tiles that require adjacency is critical to your game. These tiles take up a lot of space, so here having two dealers benefited by the same marketing department and using the same main line can be a very efficient way to go. The most challenging placement rules relate to the placement of the technology stations showing the car parts and to these small spec tokens which you'll attach to those parts. It's these little spec tokens more than anything else which is going to set the price for your cars in the market. To be allowed to place a car part token, you must have access to that part's patent on any one of the research tracks where it shows up. To place a spec marker, you must have access to that patent on that specific coloured track. You always have access to a patent if you have reached or exceeded that patent on the track. Or you can temporarily access someone else's patent if your engineering focus is high enough. Specifically, if as many players as your engineering focus number have researched a patent, then you have access to that patent. So yellow has direct access to this engine, having researched it, and with Engineering Focus 1 can access the red spec because blue has researched it. Red likewise has direct access to the engine and its green spec, but not its red spec. Only one other player has researched the red spec, and therefore at Engineering Focus 2, red has no access. If these markers were placed like this, red would now have access to the engine and the red spec by virtue of Engineering Focus 2, but would no longer have access to the green spec. The player with the lowest engineering focus will only ever have access to their own patents. You can't combine tracks to get patents. Here there is no single track where two players have researched, and therefore red will not have access to any of this. The ability to access other patents is temporary, but once you've placed a tile on your board, it doesn't matter if you no longer have access to those patents in the future. If you want to build a second copy of that tile, you must qualify again under the same patenting rules. You can't simply claim that you have the technology because you've already built one. Having worked out which tiles you can place, you must now place them legally. Each of these tiles has a letter and a certain shading, and this represents which side of a car it relates to. When you place a tile, it must either go adjacent to that specific side of at least one main line, or adjacent to another tile of the same shading and letter through which you can do a connected path back to at least one main line. Every technology station must be adjacent to at least one spec marker, and vice versa. For clarity, the spec marker points at the engine part for which it is providing the spec. You'll be trying to make efficient chains of technology tiles in this way. And you can see here some of the creative things that you might try to do. For example, using these spec markers to get around tight corners, or having a connected chain of stations and specs connecting to more than one mainline. You can come back and add more specs to your stations later in the game if you later meet that patent requirement. And be aware that you can't have more than one of the same spec marker pointing at the same station, unless it's a station like this, which has two of the same coloured number. This indicates a part which appears twice on the same spec track. You cannot have two of the same car part station connected to the same main line. So this radiator is okay. You have two radiators, but they're connected to separate main lines. But these two brakes are not acceptable because each is connected to each other and to both of these main lines. Phase 4 is print sales brochures, and this is an admin phase to take stock of the factory that you've just built. Remember that you will have one completely empty floor in your factory because this is placed at the end of Phase 3. First, count up your number of planning departments and gain one Gantt point for each. This is the only time other than setup that you gain Gantt points, and setting your focus is the only time you spend them. Now work out what specs of car will be sold by each of your dealers. And to work this out, first work out the specs of each of your main lines. A mainline has specs equal to all of the spec markers connected to it. So on this mainline, for example, out of the A side, we're connected to 2 green. Out of the B side, we're connected to a yellow and a red. C is connected to 2 purple, and D is connected to a yellow, a purple, and a red. This is Detroit's only adjacent mainline, and therefore it's the only cars it can sell. So we can move all of these cubes down to Detroit. These are the specs of the car that Detroit will sell. Kansas City has 2 adjacent mainlines, and so first we'll go through that same exercise for each of those mainlines. This again is just done by counting the connected spec arrows. Now for each of the 5 spec colours, the dealership spec is equal to the lowest of all connected main lines. So here both main lines have 2 red, so Kansas City has 2 red. Both have 2 purple, so Kansas City has 2 purple. The main lines have 1 and 2 yellow, so the lower applies, only 1. And likewise for green. As such, attaching multiple main lines can give you diversity of types of car and more capacity to produce cars, but you've got to work a lot harder to get high specifications. Finally, take from your supply the market windows corresponding to each of your dealers. A dealer with no marketing attached gets one of these small market windows. With 1 adjacent marketing, you get a medium window, and 2 or more would grant you the large window. Phase 5 is sell, 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 and this is where you'll sell your cars to the market. Players will take multiple turns in this phase in sales order, and will keep taking turns in this order until all players have passed. On your turn, first choose one of the dealers on your board. If you have not placed that dealer's market window onto the board on a previous turn in this round, you must place it now. Compare that dealer's specs with this round's 2 active specs. Here it's 2 purple and 1 green. The window must only cover squares whose requirements in specs are, at most, 2 purple and 1 green, so anything in this section of the board would be valid. The window can even overhang the left or bottom edge of the board, and everything off the board counts as 0 in its axis of spec. Naturally, you'll be looking for a high price and high volume of sales. So for example, I might place the Kansas City window here. This is also sensible because I know that Kansas City can produce both cars and trucks. Now that you've placed a window or chosen one of yours that was already on the board, you now choose one of the squares inside that window. You must then make as many sales to that square as you can. Suppose I sell to this square. One at a time, take one of the cars off the square, place it onto a matching type of main line that is adjacent to that dealer. So here it would have to go there. And check your assembly capacity. A main line with this many cars on it cannot produce again this round. So in this instance, I went to a square that could have sold 3 cars. However, because of my assembly capacity, I'm limited to producing only 2. I won't be able to sell purple cars out of Kansas City again this round. Unsold cars remain on the space. You can sell from multiple main lines on the same turn, but not from multiple dealers. Finally, gain money from your sales. Each of these shaded areas has a sale price based on this marker, which is placed in it in phase 8. So in this example, I sold 2 purple cars at $3 each, gaining 6. Trucks sell for 1 more than the printed price and sports cars for 2 more. So had I sold these 2 trucks, I would gain $8. You'll continue taking turns in sales order in this way. Choosing a dealer, placing the market window if it's the first time you've used that dealer this round, and then selling to a single square within that dealer. Market windows will often overlap as players fight for the most lucrative spaces. And choosing the sequence of your actions is critical to maximising your profits. Once no players can make any more sales, the phase is over. To finish the market phase, remove all of the market windows from the board and remove all cars and spec cubes from your main lines. But leave unsold car markers on the board. 6th is the finish phase. The game ends immediately in the finish phase if you're either in the 7th round or if the punch clock has been flipped to the finish side since your last finish phase. The player with the most money wins, and if tied, whoever is earlier in sales order breaks the tie. Next is advance expectations, and here you'll be changing what the expectations of the markets will be. This is an admin phase. First, whichever spec the obsolescence arrow is pointing at is removed and placed at the bottom of the supply. Then increase its minimum spec by 1, moving this marker up and placing the next marker onto its space of the minimum specifications track. There's a 1 on one side and a 2 on the other. From this point forward, any dealer that wishes to make a sale must meet all of the minimum specifications. For example, this dealer, despite all the other specs, would not make any sales this round. Next, ignoring the one that just came away, choose which of the remaining specs will replace it on the track. This is done by adding up the total number of research steps on that track above the minimum, and whichever one is highest takes its place. In this case, reliability has a total of 3 steps of research, safety has a total of 6, and speed also has 6. If tied, whichever track has the single furthest advanced marker beyond the minimum spec breaks the tie, and if still tied, whichever marker is at the top breaks the tie. Adjust the spec axis so that the smallest number matches the minimum spec. Here, safety has a 0 minimum spec, so this would be correct, but later in the game, if you had a minimum safety of 1, you would slide this across like so. Finally, turn the obsolescence marker to the other axis. You should note that you'll be able to predict exactly what will happen in Phase 7 from as early as Phase 1, and this gives you plenty of opportunity to plan ahead through the round. The final phase is Grow Demand. Firstly, each player plays 1 card from hand in engineering order face down. You cannot choose a card unless the game has at least reached the number of round in the card's bottom corner. And when you choose your card, place it face down in one of the 4 quadrants of the board. Once all players have played, reveal the cards, adjust the punch clock, and add the matching spark tokens to the corresponding squares of the market. Spark tokens remain on the board for the rest of the game. There's no limit to how many there can be, and they generate new demand at this point of every round. Go across the board and add 1 demand car for each spark token. Maximum capacity when doing this is equal to twice the number of spark tokens. So if placing here, you would place only 1, not 2. Cards that were played are now removed permanently from the game. Next, shuffle up all of the neutral cards and draw as many as there are players. Place 1 in quadrant 2, 1 in quadrant 3, and the rest in quadrant 1. These cards add additional cars to the board, but not additional spark markers. When doing this, you can go above the spark capacity. These neutral cards are returned to the deck for future rounds. Finally, adjust the price markers. The highest one of these 4 shaded areas that has any cars in it gets the $6 marker. The next highest gets $4, the next highest gets $3, and the last one $2 if applicable. In this way, if you create demand in the high end of the market, you'll tank the prices for the low end. You'll now proceed to the next round's research phase. Continue playing rounds in this way until the game ends in the finish phase and the player with the most money wins. And that's how to play Horseless Carriage. We hope you enjoyed this video.
If you find this video useful, please help us by hitting the like button. Subscribe to us. You can also hit the meeple in the corner to do that, and hit the bell icon if you want to know when we have new videos. You can also follow me on Instagram for my board games journey.
Comments, suggestions and feedback are all welcome in the comments section below.
Thanks for watching. See you next time.